Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're really delighted to have you all here as part of this event about the Carbon Conundrum. So for those of you who have joined our previous events and we're expecting Graham to be hosting, no, this is not what he looks like clean shaven. My name is Hannah and I'm hosting the event this evening. I'm actually an ecologist, so I'm really looking forward to learning quite a lot from our speakers and our panelists. And I will be the first person to be asking stupid questions. So I really hope you'll all join me in this opportunity to quiz this expert panel. You can do that using the Q&A box down the bottom of your screens. Please feel free to put questions in at any point and we will deal with them at the end. We also have a chat function where you can ask for help. So we have a glamorous assistant, Laura, available to deal with any problems this evening. She will be hidden throughout so you don't get distracted by her spangly outfit, but she is there and ready to make sure everything runs smoothly. I should let you know that this session will be recorded and it will be made available on the SAGES YouTube channel after the event. And I'll put a link to that in the chat later on. We also have an active Twitter account, which you may want to connect with later on. We advertise a lot of events on there, so I'll also put the link to that in the chat if you want to join us. So this event is hosted by us at the Scottish Alliance for Geoscience, Environment and Technology. Society, I'm getting carried away now. SAGES. So SAGES is a pool of researchers from institutions all across Scotland and working on a range of environmental and socially relevant topics. So if you've joined us for the past few events, you'll see that SAGES has a number of themes and forums. So that's groups of researchers working on similar topics. Now this month, we are focusing on carbon and biogeochemical cycles. And this theme brings together scientists from different universities across Scotland, all of whom are studying the carbon cycle at scales varying from microbes to the globe as a whole. Now, the aim of this theme is to identify and characterise carbon sinks and sources, and we'll talk a little bit more about them later, and understand how the carbon cycle might change. And of particular interest are forests, marsh, peat bogs, soils, anything that could be transformed from being a store of carbon to perhaps a source of atmospheric carbon as a result of global warming and things we're doing to the environment. So hopefully you'll hear a lot more about that throughout this evening. This is the 5th event in the SAGES Stories event series, which is held in the run-up to COP26, the big climate conference being held in Glasgow at the end of the year. Now, these events are really to share the excitement and challenges of finding the scientific solutions to climate change. The event series spans the globe from the Arctic to the Antarctic, trying to engage everyone with the work that's going on today. So if you'd like to find out about future events, please sign up on the mailing list link that I'll be putting in the chat a bit later. So just to give you a rundown of what's going to happen over the next hour. First off, we are going to hear from the fabulous Celeste Kellock, who will be providing us with an overview of the understanding of carbon. Then we'll have 3 short flash talks from our panel, focusing on their research and their thoughts around solutions. And then we're going to put all of them under the spotlight and ask them all your burning questions. We've had a few from social media already, but if you think of anything during the talks, please just type it straight into the Q&A box and we'll ask them as many as possible during the discussion. So first off, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our first speaker, Celeste Kellock. Hi, Celeste. Celeste is a biogeochemist, which just sounds like all the jobs in one, if I'm honest, kind of like the Swiss Army knife of science. So we're glad she's here with us this evening. She is currently completing a PhD at the University of Stirling, looking at the transport of carbon from source, mainly things like forested catchments, to the sea, so sea loss. Celeste also hosts her own science podcast, so she tells me she's looking forward to being on the other side of the microphone this evening. Celeste, over to you.
Fantastic, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So I will share my presentation with you all just now. And hopefully you can all see my screen. Okay, so yep, I'll give you an introduction to the carbon cycle. I've spent the last few years of my life trying to understand and research this area, so this is definitely a kind of whistle-stop overview, but onwards we go. So the general carbon cycle, for reference, the blue arrows are sources and the orange arrows are sinks. I'm sure we're all slightly familiar with this to some extent, but I'll run over the natural cycles that we tend to have throughout the environment. So carbon is constantly cycling throughout the environment. It is in every living thing on Earth. So natural cycles would be photosynthesis and respiration, that we see carbon exchange between the atmosphere and forests, between the atmosphere and soils and plants. We also see natural cycling in the oceans, where we have carbon cycling between the surface ocean and the atmosphere. And this tends to happen rather rapidly because surface waters are rather shallow. And within the marine environment, we have carbon cycling as well through photosynthesis and respiration of plants and animals. And as we move deeper into the marine environment, we have deeper water masses and the overall ocean circulation, where we can see carbon cycled over periods of thousands of years. But carbon does not just stay in the water or on land, and terrestrial carbon from land can easily be transported to the marine environment through the rivers. And we often see carbon, the terrestrial carbon that's transported from land to sea, perhaps stored in these coastal environments in the form of blue carbon, which I'm sure Bill is going to touch upon a little bit later. But there isn't just natural cycles. We, as humans, have caused anthropogenic emissions of carbon. And this is mainly through the burning of fossil fuels. So the Earth has this natural carbon cycle, and it stores carbon over periods of millions of years in marine sediments, where we see, lots of dead animals and plants accumulate over time on the ocean seafloor. And this forms a very high energy material. We as humans came along and thought, great, look at this really high energy material. Which on initial thought sounds great, but extracting this material has also extracted all of that carbon, which we are just burning and pumping into the atmosphere at a rate of roughly 9.6 gigatons per year. So a gigaton is 1 billion tons. That's 9.6 billion tons of carbon per year. So no small number. And we are also emitting carbon through other actions, such as deforestation and land use change. Now, this is not to say that you cannot change the use of your land. Of course you can, but what it's worth considering, especially when you're changing land use on a large scale, is how much carbon does that land currently store? What processes are you using to change your land's purpose? And for your new land use, is that going to store more or less carbon than the previous land use? Are you therefore going to end up emitting carbon into the atmosphere through this change in land use? So currently we're emitting 1.6 gigatons of carbon per year through land use change. And it's also worth bearing in mind that although permafrost might be counted as a sink of carbon currently, this could change. Permafrost currently stores about 1,500 gigatons of carbon. And as our atmospheres warm through our increased carbon dioxide concentrations, the land warms and the ocean warms, and permafrost regions are going to be particularly susceptible to this warming and potentially thaw, releasing some carbon into the atmosphere as well. So things that we see currently as sinks may not remain sinks over time. And to give you an idea of where carbon is really stored in our environment, we have around 860 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere. We have around 4,750 gigatons of carbon in terrestrial stores, and the marine environment is by far the largest, with 38,000 gigatons of carbon. So yes, although the atmosphere seems like it should be higher because that's where all the carbon seems to be getting emitted, that's come at a cost. The ocean has taken up more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and it is causing things like ocean acidification, which is the largest threat our oceans have ever faced. So let's break this down a little bit. Terrestrial carbon, we're looking at things like trees, vegetation, soils and rocks. Now, the carbon stored here is stored in the soils, permafrost, vegetation, like I said, around 4,750 gigatons of carbon. And this cycling time can span anything from, months, in the sense of trees photosynthesizing, respiring, growing, dying, and to millions of years in rocks where carbon is stored over much longer timescales. Now, land use change is causing increased emissions, and although that 1.6 gigatons of carbon might have looked small in comparison to the amount of carbon stored in the oceans, say, if we compare it to natural cycles, so a cycle that would occur with or without humans here, such as volcanic activity, Volcanoes emit roughly 0.1 gigatons of carbon per year. So we are causing very large increases in comparison to the natural cycle. And when we're talking about the marine and coastal carbon, we're referring to shallow waters, deep waters, all the organisms, plants and wildlife that live within our waters as well, and the seafloor sediments. Now, storage in our surface sediments and coasts is up to about 1,800 gigatons of carbon, and in the waters, 38,000. Now, these surface waters exchange very readily with the atmosphere. In comparison, we have deep water masses in places such as the Pacific Ocean, which can be as old as 1,500 years old. Now, these can be a mixture of waters that might be 5,000 years old and 500 years old, but there's carbon stored in these waters that moves slowly at depth throughout thousands of years. As I mentioned, these increasing carbon dioxide concentrations are resulting in ocean acidification. And this affects some of the cornerstone species in our marine environment, such as corals. Now, corals support at least a quarter of all marine life, and the degradation of corals can affect every single trophic level within the ocean, essentially life in the ocean as we know it. And as I mentioned, fossil fuels are actually ancient marine sediments that we are extracting and emitting carbon from. When we look at carbon in the atmosphere, carbon cycles throughout large atmospheric cells. Things like travel and industry that we have done are causing increased emissions in the atmosphere. And it's important to remember that what's happening isn't just going to affect people and animals in the future, but it's actually affecting people right now. Around 7 million people die every year from air pollution related illnesses. And this increased atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations that we see do not stay put. If I go out in my car, that carbon dioxide does not stay above me. It does not stay even in Scotland. These atmospheric cells can transport it to much more fragile parts of our world, such as the Arctic, and also it affects people disproportionately. Just because you don't emit as much carbon does not mean you do not see the effects, as we're seeing in Arctic areas, and as we're seeing in areas like small island nations, the Pacific Islands, for example, affected by sea level rise. When I'm referring to the journey and importance of carbon, carbon is everywhere. Everything you see contains carbon, every living thing. It can be in a tree, in the soils, it can be transported from rivers in the highlands to the depths of the Pacific Ocean. And there's a real importance in seeing the bigger picture of carbon, because how well we understand the carbon cycle refers to how well we understand life. It refers to how we understand what our impact is on not only humans in the future, but all species on Earth and the environment. So what I really want you to take away from this is our understanding of carbon really matters. It can save lives now, it can save lives in the future, it can save lives of every living thing. And what we do with this knowledge also matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Celeste, and a fantastic job at covering, I think, a lot of things in 10 minutes. So brilliant. Well done for sticking to your time limit as well. Now, I know I certainly have a lot of questions from that. I guess that's the downside and upside of such a short talk, but I'll save them till we have our panel. But if anyone else has any questions, pop them in the chat and we can fire them all to Celeste afterwards. So thank you very much. After that fantastic introduction, we're going to have flash talks from our 3 other panelists. So beginning with Essen Jorat. Now, Essen is another very handy person to know, as he has a background in civil engineering and currently works as a senior lecturer in geotechnical engineering at Abertay University. So Essen is going to talk about terrestrial carbon, and particularly around his current work. And he's also, he tells me, a very keen runner. So I'm going to hand over to him quickly before he disappears. Okay.
Well, thanks very much, Hannah. And thank you all very much for being here for this talk. And let me quickly share my screen. Okay, I believe you can see my screen now. Perfect. Okay, so in the next 5 minutes or so, let's have a quick look at terrestrial carbon. To contribute to net zero emission targets, we need to acknowledge the need to first reduce CO2 emissions. So this is through introduction of new technologies, introduction of electric cars, electric bikes, sustainable transportation systems, sustainable cities, and all these elements that we hear on daily basis. And also equally important, we need to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And this is the area where I believe hasn't been given that much attention. And in fact, this is the area where terrestrial carbon becomes very, very important. Forests hold 86% of the planet's terrestrial above ground carbon, and forest soils also hold 73%, nearly 75% of the planet's soil carbon. Peatlands contain around 25% of the global soil carbon. And in Scotland, we are very fortunate to have these vast areas of peatlands. Nearly 20% of the overall country land area is covered by peatlands, with storage of 1,600 million tons of carbon, which is a fascinating number. It is a very valuable resource that really makes us all to do everything we can to preserve it. First, preserve it, and second, to extend and expand the peatlands in Scotland. But saying that, we come across things like this. This is not a photo from 20th century, 19th century. This photo which was taken last weekend, actually. My partner and I, we were not very far from Dundee and arrived at a petrol station, pump station, and this was right in front of my car. It is actually quite shocking seeing something like this. We are in 2021 with 2045 net zero targets, and we are still selling peat as a source of fuel or compost. Every 1 millimeter, I'm speaking a millimeter size of peat to form, for every 1 millimeter of peat to form, it takes between 1 to 2 years, and 20 kilogram of peat for $6.99. This is where we are. Another source of carbon is inorganic carbon. Another type of carbon is inorganic carbon, and this is also something that has been around for thousands and thousands of years. Geological time scale, limestone is something that we all have heard. We all know limestone, and this is classified as inorganic carbon, and this is geologically available. But we would also be able to create new inorganic carbon, and through this process capture CO2 from atmosphere. And how it works is that we need to have a source of calcium in soil. So having a source of calcium in soil, through photosynthesis, CO2 arrives at soil profile, and when it's mixed with water, it creates carbonic acid. And when calcium is in the soil, carbonic acid and calcium react and form calcium carbonate, or limestone as we call it. And this is new calcium carbonate, or pedogenic carbonate, as what we call. And through this process, CO2, which is a gas, arrives in soil and forms solid matter, and it creates a stable sink for carbon. It's usually one-way process, but the sequestered carbon can go back into the atmosphere if it is mixed with really strong acid. This brings a really good opportunity for engaging urban and agricultural lands in carbon sequestration. In carbon sequestration, and this is something that I have been working on in the last 10 years, and we realized that urban brownfield sites that contain source of calcium have large capacity for carbon sequestration inorganically, and the value that we arrived at is 60 tons of CO2 per each hectare per year, which is a really, really significant number. Equally the case for agricultural lands, but with with lower numbers. In terms of the source for calcium, is something that can be acquired through basic silicate rocks or demolition waste. So I just stop in here. I don't want to go over my time, but I'm looking forward to discussing this further in the Q&A session.
Thank you, Esen. That was a really interesting introduction to terrestrial carbon, and I think we'll be coming back to some of your points a little bit later on in this session. So I see you've already got questions coming. Keep them coming in for Esen, and we'll get to them in about 10 minutes. So next up for his flash talk, we have William Austin. So Bill is a professor at the University of St Andrews and a visiting chair at the University of Highlands and Islands, which, just to be clear, is a term of extreme academic esteem and not a mobile furniture, as you may have first thought. Now, Bill is an expert in blue carbon, and in fact, so many other things that I will run out of time for the presentation if I mention them all, but I will hand over to him and give him special thanks because he is currently on holiday and still managing to join us from the wilds of Selkirk. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us, and please, Bill.
Thank you, Hannah, and it's lovely to be here. I've really enjoyed those first presentations, and I'm going to try and pick up on a couple of the points that have been made. I had 5 minutes for the talk, and I'm not going to use slides, so it's just going to be a talking head, but I hope to prompt some questions. So I want to begin by just saying that I think 2021 is an extraordinary year. You know, lots of extraordinary things happening, football and so on at the moment. But also, you know, this COP, this climate conference that will happen in November in Glasgow. The opportunities for biodiversity this year. And I think here in the UK, with support, of course, from devolved administration, Scottish Government, this focus on nature is very, very exciting. So one of the themes I want to introduce is the theme of nature-based solutions. How do we understand the opportunities that nature provides? And can we work with nature to create a better outcome? And I mean a better outcome for climate, for people, and of course, for biodiversity, for nature itself. Now, we've heard about these in the context of climate as ways of helping to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. So these are natural sinks, and this, of course, is one of the things that we're going to focus on, and I'll talk about in a moment in terms of blue carbon. But I think, as the point has already been made, we mustn't forget that when we talk about nature-based solutions, we require deep, rapid cuts in our emissions. This is a fundamental requirement. So this isn't an excuse to avoid those emissions cuts that we all have to face and contribute to in terms of net zero targets. But we do have these negative emission technologies, as they call these nets, and I'm going to just introduce blue carbon for a moment. So Celeste did a good job of highlighting blue carbon. In a Scottish context, we don't have mangroves yet, so these would be salt marsh and seagrass meadows. And they provide an opportunity through these coastal environments to sequester carbon. So the plants themselves are sequestering carbon. The nutrient-rich environments, so they're highly productive. They're very good at capturing carbon. In fact, the rates of sequestration are about 2 orders of magnitude per area higher than most forest systems. So, you know, that's quite extraordinary. If I'd asked people at the start, I think few of you would have said such a large difference. And the other positive thing that they give us is carbon storage. And again, these are waterlogged environments, low oxygen conditions. The sulfur in seawater inhibits some of that bacterial breakdown of the organics. So they turn out to be incredibly helpful places to store carbon. So they're drawing carbon down, and they're also storing carbon for us. So if we can manage these places well, they're going to lock away carbon. They'll do that year after year. But also, if they're well managed, they'll hold on to that carbon and they won't release the carbon back to the atmosphere. And I think, Hannah, you made that point yourself. The analogy is actually peatlands that Ehsan's just talked about. You know, peatlands, if they're not well managed, are actually releasing carbon that's taken hundreds, if not thousands of years, releasing that back to the atmosphere. And this introduces the notion of looking after these habitats. And we have some protection measures, but currently in the UK, we don't have recognition of these habitats as part of our greenhouse gas inventory. So some of the research that we're engaged in at St Andrews and within our wider Blue Carbon Forum that Scottish Government supports is the idea of managing some of these habitats, salt marsh habitats in particular, to bring them into our national greenhouse gas inventory. So this is a really neat thing to do, because we'll gain the benefits for that carbon sequestration and storage. We'll be able to count those towards our net zero targets. That's politically, that's great news. But the wins, of course, are for nature and for these habitats and all of the other ecosystem services they provide. So we're often preoccupied with carbon. And, you know, I don't mean to disparage our conversation this evening, but these natural systems provide all sorts of other benefits, coastal protection and so on and so forth. And we can do this by demonstrating additionality through some kind of management activity. And then, of course, if we want that long-term carbon storage, we need permanence. And this is a little bit harder for coastal wetlands, because we know that global warming is causing sea levels to rise. So, of course, this threatens the very habitats that are storing the carbon for us. And I've focused here really on organic carbon as the key part of the story in these systems. Ehsan mentioned inorganic carbon in terrestrial soils. In these coastal blue carbon systems, we know that when we form inorganic carbon, we actually release CO2. So when we talk about blue carbon, we're not really talking about calcifying systems. So the corals of the tropics and so on wouldn't be counted currently within those sorts of frameworks, because we're actually releasing CO2 in that process. But, you know, this is a very exciting area. We're very hopeful in the next few years that we will see at least one of these habitats implemented into a national greenhouse gas inventory. And I think that will create that kind of top-down policy intervention, as we have now for peatlands. So it's horrified to see the slides of peatland, of peats being sold as fuel. You know, we need to stop that. Clearly, it doesn't, you know, doesn't compute with the idea of peatlands providing a climate service. But I think this is an exciting area for our coastal habitats, and I'm hopeful as we approach COP26 that we will get some announcements from government on progress in this area. Okay, so that's me. Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks so much, Bill. And I think that was a wonderful wrap up of a lot of these conversations as well. And it leads really nicely to our final panelist and speaker, Jamie. So Jamie Toney comes from the Centre for Sustainable Solutions at the University of Glasgow and is a professor of environmental and climate science, which again sounds like quite a big topic to be in charge of all of that, but is particularly an expert in the science behind climate change, specifically understanding how different modern climate, environmental and ecosystem changes are different from those the Earth has experienced in the past. She tells me that she's particularly interested in how collaboration and interdisciplinary approaches are needed at all levels to help us make a transition to a sustainable future. And she's here to round off our talks by discussing some of the solutions and taking us into a positive frame of mind for the Q&A. So Jamie, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, so greetings everyone. I'm Jamie Toney. As Hannah said, I'm a professor in environmental and climate science at the University of Glasgow, and my research also focuses on biogeochemical cycles and with a focus on aquatic environment. So it's really great to hear all of our speakers talk today. And I've been asked to talk not only about solutions, but thinking about, what are the impacts that are coming out of the conversations. And I think we were expecting maybe to arrive at a bit of a doom and gloom sort of scenario, but I think all of our speakers have done a really nice job in showing us what the importance of our natural environment is. And so as we heard, there's many sources and sinks of carbon that move around different time scales in different parts of the environment. And ultimately what we're trying to do is find ways to reduce the amount of carbon we're putting in the atmosphere. Celeste pointed out that we're having a very strong impact on taking the sinks of carbon that have been locked away for hundreds to millions of years and putting them back into the atmosphere. But there's really positive solutions, which Bill discussed too, around nature-based solutions where, our seagrass forests and the coastal environments can take some of that CO2 naturally and store it away and lock it away. And so I was going to touch again also on Hassan's example of, seeing that peats are for sale as fuels. And that's, it's just a practice that needs to be phased out because we really need to think about our environment and how the environment can work for us. So as Hannah said, I'm also the co-founder and director of the Center for Sustainable Solutions at the University of Glasgow. Our mission is to enable individuals, communities, and organizations to take environmentally sustainable action. And we're doing that through research, through education, which is hugely important, and through partnership. So we're working quite closely with the city of Glasgow in the lead up to COP26 and thinking about what the legacy beyond that event might look like as well. What does a sustainable future look like? And so the issues that we really need to tackle as part of climate change are not only the carbon cycle that we've been talking about, but it's also the biodiversity of the planet. And thinking about all of these together, how do we live a lifestyle that keeps global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius? How do we design ways that also not only help to save the planet and help save some of the environments that we've heard spoken about so far, but how do we also do this in a way, sorry, my dog's tail is hitting the blinds. How do we do this in a way that also tackles social inequalities and benefits public health and also benefits well-being? So a lot of the solutions that have been proposed in order to do this are really based around communities. They're really based around individuals getting involved in renaturing and really valuing what nature can provide for us. And so I think that the talks tonight have been really useful in raising awareness in the kinds of issues the scientific community in Scotland are progressing to help us achieve net zero. There are an increasing number of opportunities to learn about potential solutions and actions that individuals can take. At the University of Glasgow, we're involved in setting up some community food hubs in deprived neighborhoods and other sorts of things. We're involved in greening parks. We're thinking about new heat solutions within green parks and things like that. And everything that we talk about in terms of solutions really requires us to value nature and value the environment and value what greening can actually bring to us. So as Bill talked about too, Glasgow's getting ready to host COP26 in November. This is providing us a huge number of opportunities to learn more about what we can do. And it's really the combination of new technology and individual action that's going to take us forward. And I'm really interested as we move into these conversations to hear your questions, what sort of things are worrying you, what we can do to help you move forward. So I'll end it there and really look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Jamie. If I can keep you there and invite our other panelists to pop back on screen, that would be really appreciated. And I agree. It's been incredibly nice to have an event about climate, which is actually striking quite a positive tone despite some of the challenges. So thank you for all coming in with that message. So I'm getting questions coming from all angles here, so I'm going to try and find a way to work through them. But maybe I could start with Celeste. I think you threw a lot of big numbers out there, big exciting numbers. And there have been some questions around the numbers on land use change, because I think, you know, that seems to be a huge anthropogenic source of emissions, perhaps that people don't think about beyond the kind of obvious carbon emissions we have. So I'm interested into why that is such a source of carbon. Why are we, or what is happening? What are we changing land to that is causing that? And we have a question as well that if this is clearly having such a significant impact, is planning policy taking this into account? And if it's not, should it be? So maybe you could just kick us off with your thoughts on that question.
Yeah, some great points. It definitely touches upon Eshan's note on peatlands. So, for example, in the past, we have taken peatlands, dried them out, sowed the peat, and used that land to try and plant things like trees, or tried to use it for anything else, farmland. Now, when you have such a carbon-rich environment, which is so efficient at storing carbon, and you try to change that land use, not only are you potentially emitting carbon whilst you're changing the land use and through the processes you're using, but you're also then causing a lasting effect where all the carbon that would have been stored in the future by that land is then no longer stored because you've changed it to a less efficient store of carbon. It's really, on a global scale, can be very different uses of land, I suppose. So a lot of deforestation is happening in more tropical areas where forests are being cut down for things like grassland or to grow crops to feed cattle, things like that. So it also maybe plays a part in what we eat, where it comes from, and how that land is being managed as well. Yeah, it's really a global issue, but it's essentially when people have not assessed or taken into account the significance of the carbon stores and benefits land is currently providing, and they have chosen to change it to something else without regarding this change in carbon storage and this future change in carbon storage. You've then lost a lot of future carbon storage as well. With regards to planning policy, I don't think it is as restrictive as maybe it should be. It's different around the world, different cultures, different governments will approach things in different ways, but I think there does need to be a global effort to agree that we need to perform a carbon assessment on large pieces of land before we change their use to something significantly different. I think this would have major environmental benefits worldwide and could hopefully prevent land that is a very efficient carbon store being made less so. Peatlands is a great example of that. Forests to grasslands for croplands is a good example of that as well. And it really comes around this story. There's this global drive to plant a lot more trees because trees sequester carbon in general. But even with that, what we have to make sure is that we're planting the right tree in the right place, because you could try and plant a tree on a peatland and it's actually going to store less carbon than the peatland would. Or you could try and plant trees on certain types of grasslands, which are actually already incredibly efficient carbon stores. So there's no point in getting rid of an efficient carbon store and replacing it with something that would actually be less efficient. So it's really tailoring what we use the land for to the environment. Whether it's more arid or more wet will just depend on what you want to plant there and what you want to use the land for.
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting point about the tree planting, and something that's been coming up in the news a little bit, this idea that you can offset carbon, but perhaps people aren't offsetting carbon in a way that's genuinely making a difference because they're planting trees in non-suitable habitats, for example. So, you know, I think you talked and Bill talked and Essen talked about various different carbon stores. So as a concerned member of the public, what could I be doing? Should I be planting trees? Should I be seeding seaweed? How can I support this in a way that is effective and not just greenwashing? I'm open to anyone taking that as a first stab at that, but I feel like maybe you've all got thoughts on this. Jamie, go on, give it a go.
I can say, you know, as an individual, there's a lot of different actions that we can take. We're hearing a lot about COP26 and the big negotiations that are going to be happening at international levels, and they're hugely important in terms of moving agendas and moving politics and policies forward, but at very high levels. And we shouldn't underestimate the role that individuals and the things that can be done at much smaller scales. So city scales, we've been working with the city of Glasgow quite a lot, and we've been in conversations with the mayor of New York City and other places around the world. And when you talk to, you know, people in towns and cities, you know, they're telling you that it doesn't really matter what comes out of these international negotiations in COP26, which isn't entirely true. But what matters is the cities are pushing these agendas forward anyway, and the changes that they make and the policies that they're instituting now are really important. We need to be acting now. We need to be acting across all levels. And I think as an individual, everybody's lifestyle is a little bit different. We have an upskilling course that I've been running around climate change and carbon literacy at the university. We have 188 people signed up to that across Scotland. And what each individual on the course is doing is calculating their own carbon footprint. So there's a WWF site that's really good at being able to calculate your own carbon footprint. And you can see, you know, for one person, it might be that most of your carbon emissions come from energy inefficiencies in your home. So maybe that's where you want to focus your attention at reducing your carbon footprint. But at the same time, you know, somebody else might be having really high emissions relating to travel to and from their work, and there might be a way in which they can reduce that. So, you know, we have people that are very interested in fast fashion, and that they're finding ways to actually realize, which they didn't, how much carbon goes into that and how they can reduce that. So I think for each individual, it'll probably be a little bit different in terms of where they can make the most difference, but it's definitely worth going through and doing the research and understanding where you can make a difference and you can make a change.
Thank you. That's a great answer. And it's good to know that my complete lack of interest in fashion is really an environmental choice. Essen, do you have a point to follow on from that? Yeah.
Sure. Just a quick one. Just echoing what the Jamie's point of on the carbon and all of our commitments, individual commitments in this. We know we have these ambition targets like net zero 2045, and really this requires all the cumulative individual contributions to really make a massive difference. We never would have one really futuristic technology that government would come and put forward that, and we click a button and then that sorts out all the emissions and we just suddenly arrive at net zero. It is all of our individual efforts and combined that would make a massive difference. Of course, together with all these new technologies that are being introduced on a daily basis. So it needs all of our efforts. Every single you know, effort that we put forward for fighting climate change, that's something very important.
Thank you. I think that's really positive. Celeste, you want to just jump in there?
Yeah, I'll just go off the back of that. I definitely think the phrase "every little helps" I'm a big fan of. I think every single person can make small changes and it accumulates to a huge difference, whether that's you try to grow some lettuce one year, or you try to be more mindful of where you buy clothes, or you try to incorporate a more kind of varied diet with some more vegetarian meals. I think there's something everyone can do that can suit any budget, any lifestyle. And yeah, if you want to find out more on that, there's a lot of different kind of resources out there, even on things like social media and Instagram and things like that. You can find a wealth of ideas for things to try to improve your kind of environmental sustainability.
Thanks very much. And if any of you have any ideas and want to post them in the chat for people of resources, Jamie's course sounds really interesting there, then please do go ahead while we're chatting away. So I'm almost hesitant to move on from what's turned out to quite an inspirational discussion, but one thing that came up and I wanted to pick up on a little bit was Bill mentioning the term nature-based solutions. That's not me talking. Yeah, we seem to have a lot of talk about nature-based solutions at the moment. And I guess the question is this basically just another rebranding for nature? You know, we've seen some terms in the past. And is there anything really coming from this in terms of policy and how we're actually progressing this that's positive? So I wonder if, Bill, you want to take that up? Hi, Bill. Can you, we've kind of lost your camera.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. And I really appreciated those other comments that were made as well. I mean, okay, yeah. Can you hear me okay, Hannah?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Sorry, you just broke up a little bit there, but.
Can you, yeah, I think on the issue,
Sadly.
I think one of the key issues here is, yeah, you're losing me.
I'm losing you, Bill. Sorry, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
You're very patchy.
Sorry, Hannah, can you just reframe it quickly? It was about nature-based solutions and
yeah, let's try and get Bill reconnected, and maybe you can take the mantle while he's here. So yeah, just the question was about nature-based solutions, which is obviously, it sounds like a very positive thing, but is this just another rebranding for nature without action associated with it, or is this concept now actually being taken forward and taken seriously by policymakers, for example?
Yeah, so hopefully Bill can come back and join us, but I know of a number of different initiatives that the Scottish government, for example, is taking very seriously. You know, they're doing quite a lot with the Clyde Climate Forest, which is a new initiative to reconnect forests across the Clyde region and through Scotland, not only to increase the amount of CO2 that trees and such are taking up, but also in terms of connecting habitats for biodiversity on the land, which is really, really important. So I think even at national levels, nature-based solutions are being recognized. There's a lot of conversations about nature-based solutions in coast that maybe Bill seems to not be freezing as much anymore, so he could come back in on.
Okay, I'll try again, Hannah. Hopefully you can hear me now. There is a danger in terms of the question you posed about nature-based solutions, and I think particularly around carbon, there's obviously, you know, massive interest in funding for carbon credits, and I think you know, huge amounts of global capital, which you might argue is being invested in these types of opportunities rather than being invested in direct emission reduction. So I think that would be a valid concern, and something that those of us working in and around nature-based solutions need to be conscious of. I think investments and looking at investments for nature-based solutions requires more academic research. And I think that's a great area for some of us to be engaged in going forward. Dasgupta, Sapatha Dasgupta published a very influential review of the Royal Society this year, looking at the value of biodiversity. And I think when you put that together with, you know, the amount of finance, for example, that goes into biodiversity research is about 3% of the total global investment. So we don't, I think as consumers, we don't actually pay the cost that our planet pays for the consumption that we have. So we have to recognize that, and nature often pays the price. So I think it's highly appropriate to be driving, as UK government is, it's one of its 5 key topics for Glasgow, nature, to be driving nature back up the agenda. And I would say to the audience tonight that there is an exciting opportunity. Don't often hear about them in terms of European exit, but as we leave the common agricultural policies, common fisheries policies, and so on through European exit, we can look at new opportunities for nature in some of the payments, for example, for agriculture. And I think to recognize what UK government has been doing through ELMS, for example, which is the land management payment scheme that's coming in England. I think there's a different one coming through in Scotland. There are some really exciting opportunities to drive nature up that agenda, and you know, to have appropriate payments to support nature, you know, I think is right, and this is the right time to do that.
Is it possible to pick up just really quickly on one of the things that I think Bill said, which is really, really important around carbon credits, about nature-based solutions and other kinds of solutions that we talk about, in terms of the ones that Hassan has talked about as well, is in terms of the drive for net zero, there's a recognition that some organizations and some companies, some, you know, political bodies are going to have to go beyond net zero. They're going to have to actually go negative. And so one of the things that's really, really important, and there's quite a big debate around carbon offsets and things like that, is that any of these kind of solutions that come forward, which are nature-based, are around carbon capture and storage, for example, should be really looking at taking the existing CO2 out of the atmosphere, rather than using it as a means to continue a carbon-intensive lifestyle. And I guess one of the examples is, for example, if you plant a tree to offset, you know, your cross-Atlantic flight, that tree or those trees aren't going to take the carbon out of the atmosphere for another 100 years down the line. So you're kind of putting the problem off and not necessarily solving it, even though you might feel a little bit less guilty about employing that solution. So when we're talking about nature-based solutions and various other kinds of solutions, it's very important to keep that balance in mind as well.
Yeah, Bill, did you want to come back?
Yeah, great point Jamie makes there. You know, I think one of the things we do realize is that if we invest in nature sooner, it is a long-term process. And in fact, to reduce global warming, so to implement global cooling, it's very clear that the sooner we invest in these negative emission technologies that we have in nature, the greater the gains will be. And I think there's some nice work recently published in Nature showing this through modeling. I think Jamie's point, though, is right, but I work at a very international university. I suspect the others have international student travel. You know, the students travel to study, and it's very difficult to get rid of, I think, some of those emissions. So I do think there are times when it's appropriate to try to offset. And I think that would be one example. They're not traveling to lie on a beach in St. Andrews, hopefully. You know, they are traveling to study. So I think there are places where this is appropriate action. But I think it's a really good point that Jamie makes.
Thank you so much, everybody. Celeste, do you want to make a kind of last point on that?
Yeah, I'll just jump on that. I think those are both great points from Bill and Jamie on nature-based solutions. And I think when we talk about carbon credits, I do definitely have a not a cynical view, but a slightly apprehensive view, like Jamie, thinking, okay, I'll plant a tree and I'll take 5 flights is not really equivalent, and will that tree survive? Like, is it ever going to store the carbon you think it will? You never really see that. And I think a good thing we could maybe try to implement would be some kind of pledge system where there's multiple ways to offset carbon in your own life with immediate actions, whether that's reducing the amount of times you use your car, or using more public transport, or shopping differently. You know, there's lots of personal ways, or trying to grow veg, or, you know, changing your electricity supplier. There's lots of opportunities for us on an individual level to do something. And I think it'd be good if we could see, yeah, maybe something like that implemented in the future. That's maybe not someone else will plant a tree somewhere else at some point in time. It's kind of like an immediate thing that you monitor and you know, sign up to. Just a thought.
Thank you so much, Celeste. I think that's actually a really nice point to leave this, particularly as we're coming up to the end. I'm always sorry to cut off. I think we could probably talk for another hour easily, but I am aware that you've all got some sunshine you need to get back to as well. So I just want to say thank you. I think that was a really interesting discussion, and there are some points I think I'm certainly taking away about the complexity of all the issues, and particularly in terms of longevity, but also a lot of positivity. I'm not trying to rap, it's just coming naturally, but that, you know, there are a lot of solutions out there. There are a lot of ways that this could be positively going forward. And so it's nice to be able to come away feeling that, you know, we can take personal actions, but bigger things are also happening. So thank you so much, everybody, for your fascinating talks and for being such an active part of our panel discussion. And thank you to all our participants for joining us. Hopefully you'll seen the messages in the chat about the mailing list. And I'm going to give you a wee reminder as well that one of our previous SAGES Stories events is actually a competition of making small videos actually about climate solutions around water. And there are, so I've been informed some very exciting prizes available. So please look on the SAGES website if you want to be involved in that. There's a positive action you can take. And a quick reminder that we have another event coming up in July, which if you enjoyed this one, I hope you'll enjoy that one as well, which is actually about peatlands. So following on from some of the conversation we've had today. And that's mainly around stories of peatlands. So please sign up to the mailing list or go on the website if you'd like to hear more. So finally, just to say thanks again to everybody. I really appreciate you joining, and we'll let you know when the recording's available. But thanks once again to our panelists. You can't hear the applause, but it's happening. And have a wonderful evening, everyone.